Hey there folks, Rel here. Today we'll be taking a look at oversampling as it's used in the context of first-person shooters. Understanding this concept is hopefully going to let you fire your semi-automatic weapons and burst-fire weapons a little bit faster. So your pistols, your shotguns, your battle rifles, and your burst weapon variants. And I do want to use this video as sort of a reference base for future videos, especially when getting into reviewing pistols and that sort of thing. So in every shooter, your weapons have a rate of fire, which is of course how many bullets you can put downrange in a given amount of time. In PlanetSide 2, we tend to talk about this in rounds per minute, so if you were to hold down the trigger for a minute flat with infinite ammo and no reload, then how many rounds would you fire from your weapon in a whole minute? That's how we categorize them. That's what the stats are based off as they display in the UI as well. So the Orion fires at 750 rounds per minute, the NC6 Gauss Saw fires at 500 rounds per minute, etc., etc. And from there we can usually break those numbers down and find out how many bullets you can fire per second. And this is more or less accurate, it's close enough at least. The problem that's created when we look at burst fire weapons or semi-automatic weapons is that we can never really utilize their full rate of fire. At least not unless we time our clicks perfectly, so that they completely sync up with the weapon's rate of fire. More often, we tend to do what's referred to as oversampling a weapon. And oversampling is actually thought of in two contexts. The first is that when we're firing a weapon, the animations will play, but nothing happens. So sort of like when you're spam clicking to toss your anti-infantry mines or your C4, and sometimes it looks like you should have dropped one based on the animations, but it doesn't. The second is talking about the time from when we click the mouse and the weapon doesn't fire to the time it takes us to click the mouse again so that the weapon does fire. And that probably sounds confusing when I just say it like that. So here's a chart that will hopefully help me illustrate what I'm talking about. We're going to be using the Etalon battle rifle in this example, and the Etalon fires at 333 rounds per minute maximum. So that's what the number is set to. If you look in the UI, that's what it says. Now let's say that I'm just, whenever I play with the battle rifle, I tend to I click as fast as I can, right? If I can click at 372 rounds per minute, that's 6.2 clicks per second, or about 161 milliseconds between clicks. But the Etalon can only fire at 5.55 rounds per second, which is around 182 milliseconds between clicks. So if I'm spam clicking to do damage, which is generally not a good idea with a battle rifle in the first place, but this is just an example to show you what I'm talking about, the chart is going to go something like this, which is shown over a 2-second duration, or 2000 milliseconds. The yellow marks show the maximum possible rate of fire for the weapon, which is 333 rounds per minute. The cyan colored marks are when I'm clicking to fire, if I were to just spam click as fast as I could, so it's essentially my personal rate of fire of 372 rounds per minute. And the red marks are showing the actual rate of fire of the weapon, if it were to fire every time I had a valid click. So in other words, every time I click when the weapon is actually ready to fire again. I also threw in some marks that show when the weapon would actually be ready to fire again based on when I fired a shot successfully, and those are in the violet color on the red line. Then we're going to multiply the number of times we successfully fired off a shot in those 2 seconds, and that happens to be 7 shots if you're counting the red little tick marks along the red line. Now we're going to multiply that number by 30 times because the chart shows 2 seconds of information, and we're going to come out with our rounds per minute, which is 210. So hopefully that isn't too confusing, but what it's showing is a very, very rough estimate of how much rate of fire you're losing due to clicking when the weapon is not ready to fire, when you're just clicking a little bit too quickly. So I chose 2 seconds worth of time because fights don't usually last that long, even while spam clicking, and as you can probably tell, a drop from 333 possible rate of fire down to 210 is a pretty huge difference. In an actual firefight at a weapon's effective range, the difference won't be this prevalent because even with burst fire weapons, you're not usually spamming your shots. But in close quarters, the fights are usually frantic, right? You pull out your secondary and just click, 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 click. Regardless of whether it's a pump shotgun, a pistol, or even bringing your semi-auto rifle into a base, you've probably done this before. You've probably spammed the mouse button one time or another. So there are basically 3 ways to counter oversampling your weapon. And the first is obviously trigger discipline. This is the hardest to do while you're under fire, and it's also the best option. Knowing when and which shots to take instead of just spamming the mouse as fast as you can in the general direction of the enemy is very important. But the downside of this is that a lot of people will also wait too long to fire even though their weapon is ready to go. But they're deliberately avoiding oversampling their weapon. That's kind of in the back of their mind. So they're hindering the rate of fire just due to waiting. But if you play with a weapon for long enough, you'll know exactly when it can fire again, and this is really what you want to strive for. It takes a lot of time, a lot of practice. And this is definitely a huge weakness of mine, but I find that even in a close range fight, if I actually take some time to size up the enemy, and actually aim, instead of just firing as soon as I see something, I will be a lot more accurate. And this comes at cost, of course, but if nothing else, it is a good way to practice. The second strategy really only works with burst fire weapons, and it has to do with the timing of the weapon's animation. If you fire off a shot of your burst fire weapon and then you immediately click and hold the mouse button down again, the weapon will immediately fire when it's ready. So by doing this, you're essentially getting the highest possible rate of fire from your burst fire weapon. So it's click, click and hold, click and hold, click and hold, click and hold, etc., etc. Now the problem is that most burst fire weapons make this difficult to do, because you have to click once to fire off the first shot, immediately click and hold while the weapon is going through its burst cycle. This means that it's difficult to take advantage of the strategy with two-shot burst weapons or a weapon with a higher rate of fire, but it's much easier to do with something like the jackhammer. So definitely just keep that in the back of your mind if you're the type of person who likes to use burst fire weapons. The last tip is to find a weapon that matches well with your trigger finger. In the description below, there's a website that will tell you exactly how quickly you can click over 10 seconds. Now do realize that this isn't going to be entirely accurate, because how we act while we're under fire in game isn't the same as how we act when we just know that we need to click the mouse as fast as we can. However, it does give us a pretty good baseline. So if I go there and I click as much as I can for those 10 seconds, and in my case it was 62 times in 10 seconds, and that's, I divide that 62 by 10, so that's the 6.2 clicks per second that you saw earlier. And then we times that by 60 and we have our theoretical rounds per minute. So if I'm spam clicking at 372 rounds per minute, I'm using that as a baseline. My absolute ideal weapon would be a semi-automatic weapon that fires at 372 rounds per minute exactly. But there are none of those in the game. So I'm going to take half of that number, which comes down to 186 rounds per minute. So every time I spam click twice, I want to at least be able to fire off a round. And now I have two target values that are going to work very well for me. For semi-automatic or burst fire weapons, you want to find one that either exactly matches your rate of fire or slightly higher. But the higher the number goes above my spam click numbers, the more potential rate of fire that I'm losing. So by that logic, I know that the underboss is going to work well for me. It fires at 221 rounds per minute, and even if I click as fast as I can, I'll be able to fire off a shot every 2 clicks, and I'll only be losing out on 35 rounds per minute. The Cerberus, on the other hand, does not work well for me because it fires at 300 rounds per minute. So it's both well below and above my 1 and 2 click baselines. So even if I'm firing off a shot every 2 clicks, I'm still missing out on 114 rounds per minute. And that's a pretty big hit for a weapon like this. And so hopefully that all makes sense, and hopefully my math isn't wrong. Do remember though that this logic is not without its flaws. It's just a guideline that seemed to make some sense to me. And remember that practicing proper trigger discipline is probably the best way to go. The best way you can increase your potential burst fire or semi-automatic weapon rate of fire, but it's also something that takes a lot of time and practice. If this video has been interesting, helpful, or entertaining, please feel free to like, subscribe, tell your friends about the channel, and if the method I described above does end up working for you, or if you can think of a better way to explain it, or if you have some extra advice that you'd like to offer, please feel free to leave a comment below so everyone can benefit. Thanks very much, folks. We're all signing off.